okay. Well, my husband Steve was awesome. He was my best friend. Not everybody can say that about their spouse, but he was mine. And he was an accountant, and it worked out very well for our family. He could work from home and take care of our children growing up, doing accounting for my practice. And he was really good at it. And he loved kayaking. He loved to read. I mean, he was just a really all around great guy and not somebody you would expect to get Alzheimer's. But when he was 51 years old, he started having problems with his accounting work. Um, uh, just procrastinating, not getting real simple quarterly reports done and that kind of thing. And then he'd forget if he'd been to the bank and the post office, and that got really worrisome because he was only 51 at that point. And I was 2 years younger than him, and I couldn't imagine that I'd forget if I'd been to the bank and the post office. It was just part of his routine, as an accountant. And so he was also having some memory problems. He was depressed at that point, and we took him. He went to see with a neuropsychiatrist, um, and the doctor mentioned dementia, but he said it's more likely depression that's affecting his memory. It's common for that to happen with depression, but it turned out it was probably the other way around because Steve later told me that for 2 or 3 years before I caught on, he knew something was wrong. He was declining, he was struggling more, to finish his work. And then it finally became obvious to me. He was very depressed because he was always aware throughout this whole time and after what he was able to do and what he couldn't do any longer. He was very frustrated and depressed. And so the doctor prescribed antidepressants, which would be the usual. He kept deteriorating. And by the time he was like 3 years later, 54 years old, he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And you can imagine that was a crushing blow. I know you went through that with your father too. It's like at first you just don't want to believe it, but then it sinks in that that is the reality that you're living with, especially as you watch them continue to decline. And so he was started on the usual Alzheimer's medications. We didn't really see any change from those. The most they can claim is that half the people might experience a slowing of decline by maybe 6 months. That's the best they can claim. And so he kept getting worse. And by 2008, he was 58 years old, and he had declined to the point where he could no longer do anything on a computer. He had done all of his accounting on a computer. He played on a computer when he wasn't working.
Yeah.
He couldn't even remember how to turn it on.
Yeah.
He couldn't remember how to use a calculator, just to, that he'd been using for his whole adult life. And he had to stop driving. He got lost. He ended up on the other coast of Florida one time, 3 hours away when he was driving, which was really scary. And he was going downhill really fast. He couldn't even remember to prepare a meal for himself, like lunch when I was at work, or even dinner. If I had a long day, he wouldn't eat. And he wasn't even hungry. That was the crazy thing.
Yeah.
But, 2008 came along, and we were really getting pretty desperate. And I was always researching everything I could find about Alzheimer's and looking for clinical trials. And we hadn't had any in our area for quite a while. And then two of them became available at two different centers. And we thought, oh, this is our great hope. We've been waiting. We've been told over and over, the cure is within 5 years. The cure is within, I mean, constantly hearing that. And, 5 years would come and go. And so two different drugs. And he was set up for screenings for these two drugs 2 days in a row, two different centers. And I thought, well, what if he gets accepted into both studies? Then we have to choose. And so I got on the internet and I started looking for the risks and the benefits of the two drugs. And just by chance, a press release came up that talked about a medical food that was not out yet. It was going to come out in about a year, but they had done pilot study and then a much longer study with many more people showing that when you consumed this medical food, that almost half the people with Alzheimer's had improved scores. And this was just after one dose and also over a period of 3 months. And some people were in it for 6 months, that they had improved testing on memory and cognition. which none of the other drugs have ever been able to claim. Even now, these newer drugs that are coming out cannot claim that they improve memory and cognition, but this did in these studies. So I had to find out what the heck it was. And I was able to find a patent application. And I learned a whole lot about Alzheimer's too. At that point, even though I'd been researching all of this, I hadn't come across the information that Alzheimer's is a type of diabetes of the brain. And it's very similar to type 2 diabetes in that the brain develops insulin resistance, so basically in type 2 diabetes, this happens to other organs too. And people with diabetes are at very high risk of dementia. About a third of them will go on to develop dementia. So basically, when the blood sugar is chronically high, just constantly high, you're constantly pumping out insulin from your pancreas. And over time, cells in certain organs, like the brain, can become unresponsive. They don't respond to insulin. Insulin is needed either directly or indirectly to get glucose into cells, including brain cells. But in Alzheimer's, there's certain areas of the brain that are not taking up glucose normally. And this even happens in aging. It happens in aging, but it's much, much, much worse in somebody with Alzheimer's disease. That glucose just isn't getting in the brain, and cells need fuel. And when we eat a typical diet, glucose is that fuel. So now you have a problem, where your brain cells can be swimming in glucose, but it just can't get into the cell to actually operate the cells.
Yeah.
So they malfunction and they die, these brain cells. And so, they have discovered this in autopsy studies, that people with Alzheimer's disease have decreased glucose uptake in their brain. They have insulin resistance and insulin deficiency in the brain. And there's other deficiencies too that interfere with glucose getting into brain cells, and that this worsens and spreads throughout the brain with each stage of the disease. So they coined the term type 3 diabetes to indicate Alzheimer's. This was in 2005. And this was the first time I'd ever heard about this.